You are listening to the League of Women Voters magazine on the air, and we're talking about election issues this month. Our next segment turns us closer to home. The 2020 legislative session saw a successful effort to involve and encourage young voters right here in Washington state. The VOTE Act was signed into law on March 27th. One of the primary sponsors of the legislation was State Senator Marko Liias, who represents Southwest Snohomish County's 21st district, including Edmonds, Linwood, and Mukilteo. And Senator Liias joins us now to discuss the details of this act. Welcome to Magazine on the Air.
Thanks for letting me join you.
It's great to have you here. And, you know, we are talking with you, of course, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. So let me just start by asking, how are you faring?
Well, you know, I am like so many Washingtonians have spent the last 6 weeks at home, other than a couple trips to the grocery store. So I am very fortunate that I have remained healthy and safe, as of my family members. So can't really complain about that. But obviously looking forward to a day when we can sort of rejoin our community and be together again. But in the meantime, doing my part, like we invite all Washingtonians to do, to stay home and stay healthy as we work together to combat this pandemic that's facing us all.
Absolutely. We have certainly moved completely to online meetings. Well, now let's turn to the VOTE Act. What issues were being addressed with this legislation? Why did you feel this was important?
Well, that's a great question. And, you know, we have made so much progress in our state thanks to great advocacy organizations like the League in advancing voting access and participation in our state. From the 2014 midterms to the 2018 midterms, we saw turnout go up because of automatic voter registration, same-day voter registration, and some of the other measures we've taken, 16 and 17 pre-registration. And for our youngest voters, we actually saw their turnout double from the 2014 to the 2018 midterms. Now, unfortunately, they started at a very low number, and doubling a very low number still ends up at a number that's below where we'd like it to be. And I also have the privilege of working as an adjunct professor at Everett Community College, teaching American government to students in our mostly K-12 Running Start students, but also students who are just a little bit out of high school. And I've learned through that experience sort of the importance of getting young people engaged in our elections and really examine some of the structural barriers that exist. For a lot of students, a lot of young people, they become students and they travel to a new college campus, a new community, and maybe getting re-registered, maybe making sure their ballot gets forward isn't the first thing on their list once they get to that new environment. Mm-hmm. And so that really inspired me. And then in the past, we've had presidential caucuses here to select our delegates to the National Convention, and the Democratic Party allowed 17-year-olds who were going to be 18 by the general election to participate in those caucuses. But our state law doesn't allow for that, or didn't allow for that. And so really, I think if you're going to vote in November, you should have a say in who is on that ballot. And we know so many elections are decided in the primary, sort of politically speaking. If you live in a heavily Democratic or a heavily Republican district, often it's the primary that decides who's going to be the standard bearer and ultimately who's going to prevail. And so these are some of the issues I was thinking about. How do we get young people engaged? How do we make sure their voices are heard when the decisions that are being made that really affect them are being made? And then how do we reduce some of the barriers for this unique population so that they can achieve voter participation at the same rate as everybody else in our state? And those sets of concerns, those sets of issues, my experiences as a teacher, all brought to bear on this piece of legislation.
Well, and I'm pleased to hear it sounds like in crafting the legislation, you had some input in your conversations with 17, 18, 19-year-olds. Is that true?
That's right. Yeah. And actually the issue of 17-year-olds voting in the primary was brought to me by someone who was 17. Now, I'm sad to report that we didn't get it done for him. He's now in college and finishing up at University of Washington. So, but he was super thrilled. He's now been voting for a few years, but excited to finish the job and to make this change. We also consulted with Voices for Voters who aren't engaged, who are marginalized in the process. We have a voting justice coalition in Washington that helps advocate for communities that are underrepresented. And of course, no discussion of voting would be complete without engaging the League of Women Voters. And we're thrilled to have the state team as part of the dialogue because of the League's, century now of advocacy on making sure that we have voting available to everybody.
Yes, and thank you for that. Well, let's look at then and let our listeners know what the primary changes and improvements are that made it into this legislation. Do you want to enumerate those just really briefly?
Yeah, the only change that will take effect this year is we will have student engagement hubs at our four-year campuses, our public four-year campuses, University of Washington, Washington State University, and our regional universities. We will have a student engagement hub that builds off of a really successful model that Central Washington developed between the Kittitas County Auditor and the student government at Central, where there's a kind of one-stop shop on campus where students, and not just students, anybody who wants to visit, but primarily designed for those folks that live on campus, they can go and update their registration or fill out a new registration. They can direct their ballot to them, or if we're in that period just before the election, they can print out a replacement ballot on site and fill it out and turn it back in all in one place. And so when we talk to students, they said for students that haven't re-registered or haven't gotten their ballot forwarded to them, within 15 minutes, they can walk in, get all their work done, fill out their ballot and turn it back in and be back on their way. And from the county auditor perspective, the county auditor out there shared with me that there's one bus line that runs from campus to the auditor's office. And before they put the student hub in, on election day, every single bus would be jammed full of students coming to take care of these issues at the county auditor's office. So it puts the resources and supports near where these new voters are and make sure they're connected. So that's the big change this year. As we step forward, we wanted to phase in some of the other changes because we have a new voter database and other technologies coming on board. But in the future, beginning in 2022, 17-year-olds will be eligible to vote in the primary election if they will turn 18 by the general election. So that right now speaks to 17-year-olds who turn 18 between August and November. In a presidential primary year, it would be between March and November could participate in that election. We would also allow 17-year-olds to file and run as precinct committee officers for our Democratic and Republican parties if they will be 18 by the general election. So those two changes. And then we also will connect up our automatic voter registration system with our 16 and 17 pre-registration. So a 16 or a 17-year-old who obtains an enhanced driver's license or an enhanced ID will automatically be pre-registered and automatically be registered once they turn 18. So connecting our new drivers up into voting behavior as soon as they turn 18. So that's the other major change. And there's some other conforming changes and language that is made to sort of conform to these big principal changes. But we tried to identify kind of what are a number of things we can do. None of them is the silver bullet, but what are some measures we can do to get more young people engaged in elections?
Yes, absolutely. I was interested to see that, and I think it's a good change to really move from an opt-in system to an opt-out system in terms of the pre-registration. So you don't have to make that choice. It will happen. I'm also interested in the hubs at really sounds like it was in many ways a demonstration project at Central Washington. It sounds like they were working with their auditor's office as they built this process. Where did that idea come from? Did it rise up from the students themselves?
I think it was a shared sense of frustration. The county auditor, I think, was a little frustrated that, there would be this deluge of interest right in the last few days before the election and overwhelm their team while they were doing other work. And students felt like they weren't as connected to the process. And so it was really a partnership between the auditor and the students working together. I think it wasn't explicitly a demonstration project. It was really made to solve a local problem, but we loved the idea when we heard about it so much that it makes sense to share it throughout the state. And what I really like about it is, a lot of criticisms of the idea during the process were, why are we focusing so much on college campuses? And I think it's a demonstration project for other voter engagement hubs that we can do in the future, whether it's at a assisted living facility or at a public housing community where people aren't able to access the ballot box in the same way. So I think when we prove this concept and show that for very little investment, we can get voters engaged. And if you're an auditor and you're looking at your community and you find, wow, this particular neighborhood has lower voter turnout, now we will have a tool in the toolbox to surge some resources there. What is it about this part of the community that's creating a barrier to access to voting? Let's put a hub there and see if that improves things. So I view this as sort of, that was phase one. It wasn't demonstration. It was just, we're going to do something creative. This is now phase two, where we're going to take it to a broader audience. And to me, phase three will be really focused on not just young voters, but voters of all ages, and maybe voters from marginalized communities where they aren't having access to the ballot box in the same way as others. But this year, start with students. The estimate is 200,000 students live on the 6 campuses or adjacent to the 6 campuses we're reaching. So that's a lot more resources, a lot more access for those folks, and we look forward to seeing better turnout and more participation.
Absolutely. And let me ask a little bit about funding, because I didn't see it in the bill. It sounds like to open these centers, and they'll be open for 8 days prior to the elections. My understanding is that they're to be working with their auditor's office on setting them up. Who's going to staff these, and where's the funding going to come from for them?